Baby, I've been here before. I know this room, I've walked this floor. I used to live alone before I knew you. I've seen your flag on the march. Long is not a victory march. It's cold and it's a broken hallelujah. There was a time you let me know what's really going on below, but now you never show it to me, do you? And remember when I moved in you, the morning all was moving too, and every breath we drew was hallelujah. Now the end is near, and so I face the final curtain. My friend, I'll say it clear, I'll state my case of which I'm certain. I've lived a life that's full, I've traveled every highway. I know much more than this. I did it my way. Regrets, I've had a few, but then again, too few to mention. I did what I had to do, saw it through without exemption. Planned each charted course, each careful step along the byway, and more, much more than this, I did it my way. Yes, there were times I'm sure you knew when I bit off more than I could chew, but through it all, when there was doubt, I did up and spit it out. I faced it all, and I stood tall, and did it I've loved and cried, I've had my fill, my share of losing, and now as tears subside, I find it all so amusing to think I did it all, and may I say, not in a shy way. Oh no, not me. I did it my
Thank you, Brigade and Glenn. Good afternoon, Rotarians and guests. I would like to welcome everyone to our National Indigenous Peoples Day celebration today at our meeting of the Rotary Club of Toronto. I am Kevin Power, your club president. After the Indigenous Territory Acknowledgement, the National Anthem, the Loyal Toast, and the introduction of the head table and greeting to all Rotarians and guests, Elder DeRoy will officially open the meeting and do our opening prayer, followed by our Indigenous Service Committee Chair, Bill Empey, and remarks from Her Honor, the Honorable Elizabeth Dowdeswell. At this time, I would like to acknowledge this sacred land on which the Royal York Hotel stands. It has been a site of human activity for 15,000 years. This land is a territory of the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and the Mississauga of the Credit. The territory was subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and Confederacy of the Ojibwe and allied nations to peacefully share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. As you are able, and if you would like, please stand for our national anthem, followed by the Loyal Toast. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, the Queen. Please be seated. Rotarians and guests, it is now my pleasure to introduce our distinguished head table today. With the following people with us here today: Chief R. Stacy LaForme, Chief and Counsel of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Her Honor, the Honorable Elizabeth Dowdeswell, the Lieutenant Governor of Ontario. Elder Audrey DeRoy of the Lac des Mille Lacs First Nation. Bill Empey, Rotarian and Chair of our Indigenous Services Committee. Chris Snyder, Rotarian and host to our guest speaker today. And Alain Bartleman, our guest speaker today, who will be introduced formally later in our meeting. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our head table. I can see from the chat that we have many guests and visiting Rotarians joining us from near and afar today. So I will not be doing any specific introductions today, but I do want to thank all of our visiting Rotarians for choosing our club for this makeup meeting today. Definitely hope that you enjoy the meeting. To all our guests, welcome to our virtual meeting today. please feel free to contact the Rotary office and find out how you may be able to make a difference by joining us. Rotarians, please welcome our visitors and guests in the tradition of our great club. We have a very busy agenda today, so I'm not going to be doing any announcements. I want to move forward with a very special program that we have for you today. And on that note, it is my pleasure to introduce to you today Elder Audrey DeRoy for our opening prayer.
Bonjour. Bonjour, Gakina. Greetings, everyone. Bonjour, Gishi Manito. No Kamasak Mishomasak. Chimi Guachwabanang, Shawanang, Ningabewanang, Kiwitanang. Just like greetings to Creator, to our grandmothers and our grandfathers, and to our ancestors for being with us today. Chimi Guach Nimama. Chinodin, Nebe, Manito Wabo, Eshkode. To the four elements that keep us alive each and every day. The earth, our mother, the breath of life, our water, the nebe, so important, the fire. Chimigwich nimashomis, nokamis, to Ishbiming, to the sun and the moon, and to our sky world. Chimigwich, asin gidigons, awasak, to all of the rock, plant, and animal beings. And chimigwich to ayaak, as human beings, as we're walking through COVID-19, you see how, like some of our nations throughout Turtle Island, we say we're very small. Some even say we're very pitiful, And that's because we're showing how small we really are in this huge environment. It's so beautiful, And I thank John for giving me the Sama, the tobacco. It's very important that comes, and that came through the mail, came. And I was so happy to receive that because everything goes in a good way. All the hard work that the Rotarians are doing today, it'll help. It will help with everybody who is a part of this circle today. And I'd like to say Chimigwich to, the Indigenous, the way how we see the world and how we've always been speakers to protect everything that gives us life each and every day. So I want to extend my gratitude and my thankfulness for our life today, B'Madazawin, that good life that we have. To take care of everything that gives you life. To teach and to keep our children and our families close and to take really good care of them, especially our babies, our fur-bearing babies, our little animals. They're a part of our family too. Some of us have them. And also for our communities. And to stay respectful in everything that you do. To always think about how is this going to reflect Nimama, the earth, our mother, and everything that gives us life. To stay safe during this time and always, to practice all of those public health safety procedures and to stay connected. I feel like a lot of people have lost connection because we've always done things, by cell phone or texting. We don't take the time out to visit people. And we see that now that we're in isolation, like as First Nations people throughout Turtle Island, we practice social distancing and we're still feeling like we're at our winter camp right now, And so it's like the family's super close and and always to be kind, always show that and to take care of each other. And I want to say Chimigwich to Chief LaForme for it's an honor to be in the traditional territory and to her honor and to President Power and to all the Rotarians and invited guests, and to all the hard work that the Indigenous Service Committee, all their passion and dedication for everything that they're doing for the Indigenous peoples. I say chimigwich. With that, I just want to let you know that I have food offerings here. The medicines have been burnt, and this is all for everybody that's in the circle today to take care of you. I have a life dish for you to take care of those 4 elements, the spiritual, emotional, physical, and intellectual being. And I have one for our ancestors to feed them, to never forget about them, and to always think about our future generations to come. It's very critical that we behave in a good way. And with that, I'd like to sing this song to welcome Creator and Nokumasak and Mishomasak into our circle to spend time with us, so that the work that we're doing, the words that we're saying, will be so true and honest. Migo chinishu migo neknendigo, wajash nendo dem, Anizada king indoshi, Ajudira and Indigenous cause, and I'm very honored to be here today. Miigwech. That's an old Nagman. Chimigwech the way again. The voice comes from the drum. And I like to say Chimigwech for inviting me here today. And I look forward to all the speakers. Miigwech.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dorai, for your prayer. I'd now like to turn things over to the chair of our Indigenous Services Committee, Bill Empey.
Thank you, President Kevin. Chief LaForme, Your Honor, Elder DeRoy, fellow Rotarians and guests. So last fall, our committee was busy working and meeting with the First Nation groups that we've worked with in some cases for many years. For example, we partnered with the Robin Hood Army to prepare and gather meals for the Namarez Community Center. We partnered with Honoring Indigenous People to prepare 175 welcome boxes for First Nations students arriving in Thunder Bay from remote communities. With the Native Child and Family Services Toronto, we participated in their powwow. We participated in their Sharing Hearts, Building Bones program, and we were planning another screening of that excellent documentary, First Contact. We're supporting the Water First program for clean water systems, and we were supporting the Save the Evidence campaign at the Woodlands Cultural Center in Brantford. Then, in mid-March, everything changed. The COVID crisis shifted attention to providing emergency support. Our contacts in the community told us about 4 opportunities to help. First off, our committee used our budget and got together with the food program at the Wandering Spirit School, delivering food carts to them. Then with the Andrus Foundation, we supported the Native Child and Family Services Toronto Indigenous Spirit Emergency Response Fund. That's the first 2. Then the Rotary Club of Toronto and our foundation created a COVID relief fund and accepted grant applications from all of our different philanthropic communities, committees, and the people that they know in the community. The very first grant approved was submitted by the Indigenous Service Committee, and it was for the Anishinaabe Health Foundation. We granted $10,000 to their online mental health program, providing counseling, technical support, and internet access to 100 at-risk youth. And then we arranged a second grant, a request that we arranged through the Toronto Aboriginal Social Services Council, granting $10,000 to support seniors living in the Wigwam Terrace, the Amic, and the Church Street Anishinaabe home site. So altogether, we mobilized $35,000 in support in just 6 weeks. That was a bit of a sprint. We're catching our breath. We're hopeful that things will get back to normal soon so we can get back to our original program. So that's our story for this year. Now, it's truly my pleasure to present to you the Lieutenant Governor of Ontario, Her Honor, the Honorable Elizabeth Dowsworth.
Let me say, first of all, Chief LaForme, Elder DeRoy, Mr. Power, Mr. Empey, Mr. Schneider, Mr. Bartleman. Hello, everyone. Bonjour and bonjour. It's such a pleasure to join you virtually to mark National Indigenous Peoples Day. You know, even as the COVID-19 pandemic continues to profoundly affect our lives, you've persisted in carrying on with today's event, and I think that says just a great deal about your commitment to honoring Indigenous people and cultures. I begin by recognizing that although we gather from many different places, we still come together on lands that have from time to time immemorial been stewarded by First Peoples. To them, I offer my deep gratitude and respect, and today a very special thanks to Elder DeRoy for her words of welcome and her prayer of peace. Today's an opportunity also to pay tribute to Rotarians, to your remarkable record of philanthropy and success in raising awareness and in actually solving problems. You've mentioned so many of your successes just recently, and I think of many that I'm aware of. The support that you've given, for example, to the Mamawi Center in Manitoba, delivering emergency kits, the student exchange program between John Palani Collegiate Institute here in Toronto and the Moose Creek First Nation, and of course your support of skills training and programs. But it's particularly the effort that you've all put into supporting communities during this time of crisis that is worth remembering today. So Rotarians, I do know that you're making a significant difference. This pandemic has caused us to think deeply about what's actually important in our lives, what's meaningful and what's essential. And for most of us, there's a yearning to get back to normal. Yet deep down, we know that we won't be returning to normal. We're learning some important lessons about things that need to change. So my challenge to you is to take part actively in designing not merely a new normal, but a better normal. For we must dare dream of a society that is better, that is fairer, that is rebuilt to make the most of humanity's resilience. There is so much that we can do when we work together. I want to take a moment to pay sincere tribute to my predecessor, the Honorable James Bartleman. I know that he was instrumental in getting the Rotary Club of Toronto started, and I want you to know that I'm always grateful for his wise counsel, and I'm wishing him well today. And to Alain Bartleman, who joins us today, may I say just how very much I'm looking forward to hearing your insights. I know that you've been advocating on behalf of First Nations communities over the years, and it's precisely during times of crisis that we will benefit from your experience in helping us find productive ways forward. Finally, to all of you participating today, thank you for your support of Rotary. Your time, your energies, and your resources make such a valuable contribution to our communities. I wish each and every one of you continued good health. Merci, miigwech, and back to you, Kevin.
Thank you. Thank you, Your Honor. It is truly a pleasure having you join us today as part of this special meeting. We are very pleased to have you join us once again and look forward to welcoming you again in the future. So, without further ado, we have Chris Snyder with us here today, and I'd like to turn it over to Chris to introduce our guest speaker.
Thank you, Kevin. Chief Laforme, Your Honor, Elder Leroy, President Kevin, Rotarians, and guests. About 14 years ago, our luncheon speaker was the Honorable James Bartleman, who was the first Indigenous Lieutenant Governor of Ontario. Before he became Lieutenant Governor, he had a very distinguished career with Foreign Services and had several ambassadorial posts, not the least of which were being High Commissioner for Canada in Australia and South Africa. But his talk to us about 14 years ago was significant to us in many ways, and Her Honor has already alluded to them. He spoke that day on mental health, a lot of it to do with the mental health of Indigenous people, but it led in part, as Her Honor mentioned, to us setting up the Indigenous Services Committee and then to HIP Honoring Indigenous People, which is a Canada-wide organization to which about 300 clubs in Canada are now focusing on Indigenous issues. He also helped us come up with our goals and focus, which is education, awareness, and building of relationships. But the other thing which is very significant about that particular day is what's happening today, because our speaker is his son, Alain Bartleman. Alain is a lawyer. He's a member of the Chippewas of the Rama First Nation. He was educated in many international schools around the world, Upper Canada College, the University of Toronto, McGill, and the University of Geneva. Instead of practicing law with a downtown firm where he could make probably much more money, he decided that he would follow his family heritage and work in Indigenous law with Indigenous people. He's based in Rama, and his focus is on Indigenous governance and community legal issues. As well, he does a lot of work for individual Indigenous people. Recently, he was a member of an Indigenous team working on a diamond mine in Attawapiskat. He also serves on the board of Native Child and Family Services and is a member of the fundraising committee of the Anishinaabe Health Center. Alain is going to be speaking to us today and help us clarify the complexities of Indigenous governments and other governments in this country. In fact, the title of his talk is Power, Pipelines, and People, 3 Levels of Government in Canada. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our guest speaker, Alain Bartleman.
Thank you, Chris, for your introduction. And Chimigwich, Chief Laforme, Your Honor, Anishinaabe DeRoy, as well as Rotarians. It is an honor and a pleasure to be addressing such an audience. And it is my hope today that our discussion can go some ways to fostering a better understanding between First Nations and the settler communities who share this land. Needless to say, over the course of this discussion, I will be speaking in my own capacity as an Anishinaabe person who happens to have some legal training, and not on behalf of either my firm, Nawagabo Corbiere, or on behalf of my clients. When Chris Snyder asked me to speak at this Indigenous Peoples Day luncheon, it was in the midst of the Wet'suwet'en protests. And Chris asked me to explain in a few words about how a judicial decision in British Columbia could erupt or cause the eruption of protests not only in British Columbia, but across Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Ontario, Quebec, and the rest of our country. And to provide any hope of doing justice to the enormity of that particular task, I often find it helpful to go back to first principles, which is what we'll be doing today in our discussion. And to start the discussion, I found it particularly apposite to look at the words of Justice Binney of the Supreme Court of Canada, writing in a 2005 court decision called Mikisew Cree. And there are 2 sentences in particular that stand out for me. The first sentence reads as follows: "The fundamental purpose of the modern law of Aboriginal treaty rights is the reconciliation of Aboriginal peoples and non-Aboriginal peoples and their respective claims, interests, and ambitions." The second sentence reads as follows: "The management of these relationships takes place in the shadow of a long history of grievances and misunderstanding." And so today it is not my intention to go through the long history of grievance and misunderstanding that led to the Wet'suwet'en protests. Instead, I argue that it is the failure to respect the treaties, whose absence is very much felt, especially in British Columbia, and the failure to respect the spirit in which treaties were negotiated, that is the cause of many of the difficulties plaguing the various nations and peoples who make up this country. And to do so, I'll begin first by noting the extreme importance that treaties played in the foundation of the country that we now know as Canada, and how the failure of the Crown to honor the spirit underlining these treaties created the conditions for the often problematic and fractious relationships plaguing First Nations, Indigenous peoples, and non-Indigenous communities within this country. And I'll finish with 2 suggestions for how we as a society can move forward to reconcile, as Justice Binney said, the claims, interests, and ambitions of the various peoples of this country. Before we go further, however, a brief note on terminology. I'll be using the term First Nations, not Indian bands. The term Indian band is a construct. It is an imposition imposed on the First Nations of this country by the virtue of an act of 1876 called the Indian Act. It is not a term that First Nations would have recognized 200 years ago. It is not a term that First Nations will often use in describing themselves, and it is not a term of which I'm especially fond. A second note as well, when I make reference to the Crown, it is not with reference to particular individuals, rather it is to the overall system of government and governance that has often been put in opposition, rightfully or wrongly, to that of First Nations in this country. To begin, and if there's any one takeaway that I would respectfully suggest we have from my presentation today, it is that as a matter of history and as a matter of law, First Nations were here when the Europeans came and have never been conquered. That line is an excerpt from a Supreme Court decision published a number of years ago entitled Hide a Nation. Chief Justice McLaughlin wrote those words. And to hold otherwise is to subscribe to an incorrect and unsupported understanding of the history of this country. When Europeans arrived in North America, they did not arrive to find an empty land. Instead, they stumbled upon a territory that was, we suspect today, home to around 60 million persons, organized into various political entities, organized and with various claims and assertions over their own lands, claims that were recognized and affirmed by the Europeans who arrived and who in no short order were able to recreate and reproduce many of the diplomatic and respectful treaty relationships that both sides would have been familiar with throughout the course of their respective experiences. To put matters into context, the modern era of international politics, which many, if not most, scholars of international relations hold, began in 1648 with the Treaty of Westphalia, occurred in the middle of the interactions of European powers with First Nations. By 1648, the French had been already established in North America for over a century, the English, at least through the form of the colony of Virginia, for under half a century, and the Spaniards for over 130 years. To add another layer of context, the First Nations of this country and of North America had been organized and using trade routes for well over 3 millennia. And throughout the period in which we're concerned, the 17th and 18th century, First Nations, as political entities, guarded their roles as nations through a mixture of intelligent politicking, robust governance, and, it must be acknowledged, a capacity for violence that shocked and forced a measure of respect on the part of their European contemporaries. All of these were strategies deployed as a means of preserving their own governmental power and authority in an era of epidemic, climate change, and mass migration, both coming from the Atlantic and in response to those migrations. And the point of this is to note that when the European powers arrived in North America, and especially when they reached the Great Lakes, these European powers found themselves confronted with sophisticated pre-existing political orders that laid claim to the land and exercised many of the rights and functions that we today associate with governance. And statehood, capacity to determine membership, the establishment and enforcement of legal regimes, and the exercise of their authority over particular defined jurisdictions of land. And so when we look at 1763, that being the date of the Royal Proclamation, we have in place, and have had in place by that time, a measure of recognition on the part of both the European powers, foremost among them being Great Britain, and the various First Nations, that this was not a relationship of a conqueror to a conquered person, but rather between two politically equal bodies of government that needed to reconcile the claims of one with the other, the claim of those who were already present in the lands and those who were arriving. 1763 is especially important to any legal historian or to any historian of this country. The Royal Proclamation marked, in very simple terms, a recognition on the part of the Imperial Crown that First Nation lands, the so-called Indian country, was off limits for settlement, and that any interactions with these Indigenous bodies, these Indigenous political organizations, were to be intermediated through the Crown, most usually in the form of a treaty. It was not the first recognition of what we would today call a nation-to-nation relationship, but it was, however, an important step in that it affirmed the relationship of the Imperial Crown and First Nation governments. It affirmed it insofar as it was a special legal relationship that set as its premise the reconciliation of both governments. So that poses the question, how did this work in practice? Well, it worked in practice through documents and perhaps more accurately, in fact, much more accurately, relationships called treaties. And treaties reconcile pre-existing political and legal orders, those of the First Nations, with those arriving from on the other side of the Atlantic. And at their heart, treaties are a way of reconciling these two political orders over particular areas, over land and waterways and lands found within waterways or islands. The Treaty of Niagara, entered into shortly after the Royal Proclamation between many First Nations and the Imperial Crown, is a good example of the notion of reconciliation. The Treaty of Niagara of 1764, just a year after the Royal Proclamation, marked an extension of the covenant chain that linked the Haudenosaunee peoples to the British Crown and extended this to cover the Anishinaabe peoples of the Great Lakes. For the First Nations who engaged in the negotiations and discussions that saw their terms, that saw the terms of these negotiations reflected in a written document, the Treaty of Niagara, as well as through other non-written documents, the notion of a land surrender or a land purchase was not on the table. Rather, what these First Nations, what these governments agreed to was an agreement to share the land, to reconcile the claims of the arriving political order with those that were already there in a relationship founded upon mutual respect, understanding, and commitment to work together to share the land. The notion of sharing the land would continue throughout most of the 19th century. From the Robinson-Huron and Robinson-Superior treaties all the way through to the numbered treaties of the mid to late 19th century and early 20th centuries, the notion of sharing the land was an important, and I would say, integral part in the First Nations understanding of to what they were committing themselves in their capacities as government. As you might imagine, treaties are foundational documents in the history of this country. This position has been affirmed by the Supreme Court on numerous occasions. To adapt their words in Suey, Badger, and Marshall, treaties are solemn documents. They're closer to sacred texts than they are to contracts, and the method of interpreting treaties is very far removed from the method that one would deploy to interpret a commercial agreement or a straightforward purchase and sale agreement. This is, of course, founded upon the realization and the recognition that treaties are a means of reconciling existing political orders with arriving political orders. Because these documents presuppose the equality and rights of both parties, one side cannot extinguish in one form or another the rights of the other. So far, so good. We have, at least by 1764, an awareness on the part of the Imperial Crown and on the part of the First Nations of the need to work together to affirm their rights, to reconcile the claims of both parties over land, and a method of doing so. The engagement of a relationship is intermediated through a document known as a treaty. Yet here we are in 2020, and it is no surprise to anyone listening to this presentation that things have not gone as our Anishinaabe ancestors, or I would dare say, the descendants of the imperial agents who negotiated these treaties in the 17th, 18th, and 19th treaties would have intended. By almost every conceivable metric, my peoples, the First Nations of this country, are doing disastrously by most measures of human flourishing. Whether that is reading, high school graduation, incarceration, obesity, or life expectancy, and the relations between First Nations and other levels of government has been plagued by distrust and lack of respect. How did we get to this position? As I've mentioned, and as elders will tell you and the courts will agree, the written text of a treaty is not enough to understand its content. Again, the Indigenous understanding of the treaties, the Indigenous understanding of the relationship is vital to understanding how both sides understood their obligations. And therefore, to speak of treaties as mere documents of surrender and cession does not present the whole picture. And with this in mind, simple answer to the question of how we got here, how we got to a position where a court decision in British Columbia could result in protests erupting across the country, can be answered with reference to the conduct of the Crown over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries, both in terms of ignoring the spirit of the treaties that were entered into, or alternatively into sidestepping the treaty process entirely and arrogating onto itself the ability to make decisions with no regard for the validity and the importance of the First Nations governments over the lands that the Crown purported to act. An example of the former would be the piece of legislation now known as the Indian Act, originally published in 1876 as a compendium of pre-existing pieces of legislation. The Indian Act, very simply put, and as lawyer and legal scholar Jen Tellett will say, had two objectives. First being the administration of Indian lands to the maximum extent that the Crown thought it could get away with, and the destruction of the Indigenous peoples of this country in their capacity as Indigenous peoples. It is worth noting the extent to which the Indian Act is unique in the history of this country. It is a single piece of legislation that gives or purports to give one level of government the right to speak and to make decisions for another group of persons with pre-existing legal traditions, with pre-existing cultural traditions. Compare this to the relationship and to the promise of mutual respect, to the extension of alliance and respect portended by the 1764 Treaty of Niagara. And then compare the Indian Act. We saw a sea change in those periods. In the 98 years between 1764 and 1876, we went from treaty, respect, to genocidal intent and the administration of lands. In others, most notably in British Columbia, the Crown simply decided to ignore the treaty process and to ignore the First Nations governments present in place, to ignore the First Nations peoples. In British Columbia, in contrast to many other parts of this country, notably Ontario and the prairies, the Crown simply sidestepped the Indigenous governments that were present, placing their political acumen in effect on a bet that the First Nations present in British Columbia would be wiped out by famine, by disease, by forced assimilation, by enfranchisement, by residential schools. And that regardless of the illegality of their acts, the First Nations in British Columbia would be so weakened, so disheartened, so dispirited that they would be unable to assert their rights and to protect themselves. And so we have at least a partial explanation for the protests that arose this year, but also for the feelings and the justified reactions, I would say, of many First Nations in response to yet another encroachment and yet another overstepping of the Crown's rights and responsibilities over First Nations governments. Needless to say, while it's been a rather unfortunate century and a half for the Indigenous peoples of this country, we are still here. We are still Indigenous. The Crown's gambit in British Columbia has failed, and that province has turned into the juridical cockpit for Indigenous rights litigation in this country. Of the major decisions addressing Aboriginal title in Canada and in Canadian law, nearly all have come from British Columbia. The decisions of Delgamuukw, Tsilhqot'in, and Haida Nation, which I quote an excerpt earlier in this presentation, have all emerged out of British Columbia. And the First Nations there have survived, have endured, and moreover have flourished, not as mere groups of persons, but as political organizations in their own right. How do we move forward? To move forward as a country, together, to reconcile the claims and the ambitions of First Nations and of the Crown, I suggest we need to do two things. First, we need to honor treaties in their entirety. It is not enough, and it is inadequate, that today in 2020, the government can fall back on the black letter of the law, of the treaty, and ignore the Indigenous understanding that underlay the relationship between First Nations and the government. The courts have affirmed this for at least 30 years. Yet progress is slow, and too often do Crown or Crown agents reply with a shrug or at worst a legal onslaught and counter-argument when confronted with the Indigenous understanding of the spirit and intent of treaties. And second, we need to reconceive of the urgency of the task for reconciliation. As my friend and colleague, the Honourable Stephen O'Neill, formerly of the Ontario Superior Court, notes, justice delayed is justice denied. It is unacceptable that in this country it has taken over 40 years for the Government of Ontario to negotiate a treaty with the Algonquins of Ontario. It is unacceptable that 36 years after the Wet'suwet'en and Gitxaałin people first entered the Canadian judicial system in good faith, seeking to work through the auspices of the courts, declarations of their rights and of their titles, and an affirmation of the same over their lands, no progress has resulted in a final determination of those merits. We need to do more. We need to do better. Refreshingly, we are in an interesting time in our country's life, where not for the first time, but probably for the first time in a generation, Indigenous legal issues and Indigenous issues writ large are at the forefront of our civic life. These issues are multifaceted and they are complicated. For every point that I have raised in this brief presentation, many will no doubt raise other points just as valid and that speak against what I have raised. Yet I suggest there are two basic truths that if we wish to advance the cause of understanding and reconciliation between the First Nations of this country and that of non-First Nations, we need to keep in mind in order to avoid a repeat of what has come before. The first is the fundamental truth that Canada's Aboriginal peoples were here when the Europeans came and were never conquered. The second is that while many First Nations reconciled their possession and sovereignty over the lands they occupied with the claims and the sovereignty of the Crown through negotiated treaties, some did not. Both those First Nations that reconciled with the Crown through treaties and those that did not are worthy of respect. And there can be no reconciliation between the various nations of this country, first or otherwise, without acknowledgement of the importance not only of the treaties as written documents, but of the spirit of mutual respect and understanding that underlay them. Miigwech.
Thank you, Alan. We have a question here. By sharing, does it mean 50-50?
I don't think that we can speak in terms of a mathematical formula. Every First Nation will have a different understanding. And while it would be very simple to say, here is a basic entitlement, here is a cap, or here is what you're allowed to do within very set and defined bounds, that's regrettably not how these negotiations often go. They are multifaceted and they are ongoing. If we think, for example, as to how the federal and the provincial governments work, there are ongoing and constant discussions with respect to jurisdiction, with respect to funding, and with respect to operations. And I would suggest that if we wish to honor the spirit and intent of the treaties as an agreement to share the land, we need to appreciate and to focus on the relationship rather than the particular outcome. Relationships lead to outcomes that work for both parties.
Thank you. We have a few more questions here. Someone is asking if you can share the two basic truths again on which you ended your talk.
Of course. The first truth is that the First Nations of this country, the Indigenous peoples of this country, were here when the Europeans arrived and were never conquered. The second truth is that while many First Nations, those groups that were here when the Europeans arrived, reconciled their claims, their ambitions over land with the Crown, with the Imperial Crown through treaties, through negotiations, others did not. Both, however, are worthy of respect. Both First Nations that did reconcile their claims through treaties and those that did not. Both need to be taken into account. Both need to be respected as actors within a legal system and also political actors themselves. They are, I would say, the third level of government in this country, along with the federal government, the federal crown, and the provincial crowns and the provincial government.
Thank you. Do treaties only cover reservations or traditional territories?
The simple answer to that is that treaties will cover or will cover the lands that were asserted by and controlled by First Nations before they were negotiated, and will often give rise to Indian reserves, as that term is defined in the Indian Act.
Thank you. And then a current one. Do you see the current crisis in policing as an opportunity for increased dialogue with First Nations governance and equity?
Absolutely. There's an old, I don't know if this is true. I'm afraid my Mandarin, my Chinese is not very good, but my understanding is that the Chinese characters for crisis and opportunity are very similar or the same. And I see the discussions that are happening around, especially the racial component to policing, as being very positive. It's of no surprise that the Indigenous peoples of this country are dramatically overrepresented in the criminal justice system. When I practiced as a barrister in downtown Toronto and practiced in criminal law, it was quite common knowledge that around 30% of the population of correctional institutions was Indigenous, despite Indigenous persons only forming 3% of the population as a whole. Grossly disproportionate. And I think to confront the issue of racism, whether it be classified as systemic or not, means understanding and respecting and taking as a baseline respect for Indigenous persons as they would have constituted and do constitute themselves in political organizations.
Thank you. Why would the Haudenosaunee in Ontario rise up in support of the First Nations in BC when they are so far apart geographically?
I think it was Dr. Martin Luther King who said that an injustice somewhere is an injustice everywhere. And without speaking for the Haudenosaunee peoples, to see a overriding or a disrespect of the Wet'suwet'en peoples and their own forms of governance in British Columbia is an affront to the jurisdiction and to the rights of First Nations outside of British Columbia, who may not form a part of the Wet'suwet'en group, but who nonetheless feel their fates quite closely tied to the treatment of the Wet'suwet'en governance.
Thank you. How can individuals participate in a meaningful way, especially those living near Indigenous lands, on a day-to-day basis as neighbors?
I think the act of thinking about how can you best help is enormous, and it's a good sign. And using the term neighbors is also a very good sign. Foster neighborliness with these Indigenous communities. Invite them out, get to know them. Be a good neighbor. Respect the teachings. If you can, if you feel comfortable, ask to speak to an elder. Try to obtain the worldview that the Anishinaabe elders, that the Haudenosaunee elders have kept and have transmitted. Canada is a multicultural country. That does not mean merely English or Anglo and Franco, but it also means Indigenous as well. Understand the Indigenous worldview as best you can.
Thank you for that. We have a question. Why does it take so long to negotiate a treaty?
Well, when you get the lawyers involved, things tend to slow down. There are many moving parts, and it is often quite difficult politically to justify the expenditure of a great deal of treasure and funds in the negotiation of a treaty. And there are also the interests of what have historically been called innocent third parties to keep in mind. I do, however, think that a great deal of the delay has historically been a reluctance on the part of the Crown to recognize Indigenous rights. And unfortunately, to have to recognize that in many cases, the Crown's conduct over the last century and a half has been less than what the courts require, which is to act with honor. It's a very difficult thing to acknowledge.
Thank you. To ask for your impressions of progress in relationships, notwithstanding legal treaty issues, between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, given the recent emergence of increased awareness and interest in Aboriginal culture by non-Indigenous people.
It's been phenomenal. In the 3 years that I've been doing this, I've noticed a positive change. There is far more interest, there is far more awareness of Indigenous rights, Indigenous issues than there was in the past. Likewise, I'm very heartened by the changes in attitude, especially among young persons towards the question of Indigenous rights. When I was at U of T, when I was at Trinity College, it was simply never brought up. I can think of one example where, over the course of my BA in History and International Relations, Indigenous affairs or Indigenous history was raised. It was an offhand remark by Professor Robert Bothwell in History 311, who said something to the effect of, you should never tell First Nations that they were conquered because that's not true. And then we went on to talking about William Lyon Mackenzie King. And that was that. I think that lack of awareness, that lack of discussion would be unfathomable today.
Thank you. What progress is being made on combating the gross overrepresentation of Indigenous children in the child welfare system?
That's a question that's very dear to my heart. There's three prongs. One of which is we have changes in the way by which many Child and Family Services agency approach the issue of apprehensions. It simply is no longer the preferred, if it ever really was the preferred way of addressing these issues. The second is we have a reclamation of jurisdiction. First Nations are reclaiming the jurisdiction to address questions of child and family services. There are separate organizations being created that are being run by First Nations that are doing, and I'm very partial, obviously, because I have friends who work for them, doing a spectacular job of ensuring that families stay together, that they are being provided with culturally appropriate counseling and assistance. And the third is you have greater cooperation within the traditional child and family services models and organizations and entities, and those that are explicitly focused, as is Native Child and Family Services of Toronto, to ensure that children within the traditional or the let's say the non-Indigenous focused child and family services agencies are being assisted by those who have a measure of cultural and other competence.
Thank you. As Rotarians, what is our best action plan?
Keep doing what you're doing. I will never say no to speaking to the Rotarians because I know that they have their heart in the right place. And more importantly, they put their money where their mouth is. And it is both encouraging and profoundly moving to see Rotarians, first of all, be willing to educate themselves on rather unpalatable truths, and then take concrete steps to confront issues of racism, as they did when and I think it was John Andrews or maybe it was Bill who went up to Timmins to show first contact in Timmins, to attend at powwows, to attend at cultural events and gatherings. I think it's tremendous. Keep doing what you're doing. Ask questions, and keep being willing to take the difficult steps of education and outreach.
Thank you. So the next question is elected vis-a-vis traditional chiefs, which take precedence?
Depends who you ask. If you ask the federal government, they will, in most cases, far prefer to deal with the elected Indian Act for chiefs and councils. Again, though, keeping in mind that we owe respect to First Nations as political organizations that have a right and have historically governed themselves. The relation between the Indian Act chiefs and the hereditary, or what I prefer to call the traditional system, is something for each First Nation to determine. It is not for an outside government to come in and say, we're going to talk to you, but we're not going to talk to you. I think that is a recipe for disaster, and it in fact has been.
Thank you for that. And I think the last question flows similar to that, just to comment on the two levels of First Nations government, elected versus hereditary. So and that was the last question that I had. So is there anything you wanted to add on that, or?
No, except to remind the Rotarians and really drive home the fact that when we speak about First Nations, we are speaking about government. We are speaking about governments that not only exercise the function of government, but also have their own cultures, their own languages, their own histories. And to look simply at the chief or the council of a First Nation is really to see the tip of an iceberg. there is so much that goes on within an Indigenous community that is not shown by looking exclusively at its formal written down governance mechanisms.
Thank you, Alain. Thank you for the perspective you have shared with us today and providing us with the historical background and also how we, as Rotarians and we individually, can move forward towards reconciliation. For sharing with us that the Indigenous people were here first and were never conquered. The notion of sharing the land and to recognize the Indigenous understanding of the treaty and the need to honor treaties in the entirety. It does explain how we got here to where we are today and the protests that developed this year. We thank you very much for your presentation for us today and providing us with this with an education and a perspective that we can all take into account. So as a thank you for speaking to our club today, a donation has been made in your honor to Water First. Water First is Canada's leading charitable organization working with First Nations communities to resolve local water challenges through education, training, and meaningful collaboration. Since 2009, Water First has partnered with over 40 Indigenous communities in Ontario, Quebec, and Labrador on a variety of education and training projects focusing on drinking and environmental water. This donation is made in partnership with our club's Indigenous Services Committee. Thank you.
Jimmy Quick, that's absolutely wonderful.
Thank you. I'd now like to pass this part of the meeting back to Elder DeRoy for her closing prayer.
Miigwech, for all the words that we've heard in such a short period of time. You know, to have Creator and our ancestors sitting with us as we do this work, and to hear the kind words of her honor. To give thanks to Chief Laforme for having us in the traditional territory, for the Indigenous peoples of that area, and for all throughout Turtle Island. Miigwech to Alain Bartleman for sharing the First Nations Indigenous knowledge and his experience so openly, so sincere, kind, and so truthful in his informative presentation. It just brought me back to all the things that I, had to go back to university to learn a lot of what he had offered us today in such a short period of time. And I pray that that has enriched your lives and to hear the truths of Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island. And I also feel like for the Rotarians, for the Rotary Club, for inviting all of us to this platform on this virtual web, on the big web of life, to keeping us all connected. And so I'd like to thank Creator and our grandmothers and grandfathers for coming to sit with us. And as you know, in Indigenous culture, we have no beginning, no end, no opening, no closing. What we have is a welcoming and a see you later. And I learned so much again today. And like what Elaine spoke about with the truths and working with Indigenous people and having those relationships is very, very critical and important. And I'd like to also give thanks to my good colleague, Andre Morso, for leading me to this trail, to this group of people. And I'm very honored to be here today. So in so saying that, I'm going to be singing a traveling song. And this song is about people packing up their canoes or, packing up their papers as they're finishing the day and they're going to go home. And this is for safe travels. This is actually taking care of your spirit too. If you feel like you're kind of wandering aimlessly and you don't have a focus, this song really helps to bring you back. And I'd like to say Miigwech once again. Miigwech Gishimato, Nokmasak Mishomasak for sitting with us today. And the song is about, sending them back to where they came from. Aha Miigwech. The song talks about "We'll see you later." Which to all the invited guests that sat in and listened to all the information that was delivered to us today, all the teachings. I received so much from today. Chimigwich mino bamarazawin for the good life that we have. Everyone, please stay safe, be well, and take care of yourselves. Stay connected. Miigwech. Ikanagdinawi maganak all my relations. Gigabawabmanak. We'll see you again. Hopefully on some trail. Peace out.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for your prayer and for participating in our meeting here today. I have a special thank you, and I would like to give a round of applause after as well for our Indigenous Services Committee for organizing this powerful and impactful lunch today. I'd like to ask all committee members to stand to be recognized. So thank you to Bill as chair, Mary Law as liaison director, and all the committee members, Andre Morisseau, Carolyn Anthony, Chad Mitchell, Chris Snyder, Darcy Higgins, David Levy, Emery Yugar, James McDonald, John Andrus, Karen Stott, Mitra Godarzi, Peter Love, and Stephen Smith. I'd like to thank them not only for organizing this great lunch today, but all of the work that the committee has done this past year. Rotarians and guests, please join me in a warm round of applause for our Indigenous Services Committee. Now, next Friday is June 26th. It's the last meeting of our Rotary year. So it will be our Rotary changeover, and I will be your speaker. And I'm going to be able to share with you our successes as well as our challenges from the past year. And then I get to pass the gavel over to your new incoming president, John Fortney. This was such a special and impactful meeting today, and it's great that so many could join us from near and far away. in celebration of National Indigenous Peoples Day. We hope you enjoyed it. Chi miigwech. Be safe, everyone. This meeting is adjourned.
Grant, President Kevin Power, for everything you've done.
Thank you.